And if I look at some of the modernist thinkers and how they sort of romanticize the pre-Christian world, they always talk about a romanticized view of an identity that's malleable, and that anybody can be themselves and they can create themselves. I thought it was quite funny actually when I saw the documentary by Mathúna, where he actually tried to put that to the test, and he went to the Swahili tribe or something, and he started bringing up to them all these ideas, which everyone presumes are new ideas, but they're actually old failed ideas. And that's one of the things I want to look at again, is the old failed ideas that keep returning with the new guys. But it was quite funny that everybody in the tribe laughed at it. Nobody took this seriously. When you take it, because when you think about it, it's not a serious idea. Anyway, the reason that the transhumanism idea came to my mind was I've been studying Milton's Paradise Lost, and how he describes this recurring failed idea that keeps popping up. And it's the idea of creating your own paradise on earth. So this is what happens again and again and again. And we see this in the conversation throughout. But the originator of this is, of course, Satan himself. He is one of the chief characters in the book. People have often said that Milton was at the devil's party. And looking at it, I can see that he does put his arguments quite eloquently. But he also shows the seed of destruction in them. And I like that about the book. I put my thoughts down on paper because I know I always forget about 60% of what I meant to say. So I'll be putting noise down and up and all that. So just bear with me if you don't mind not talking directly, but sometimes having stuff read to you. Here we go. So the character of Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, he's got many memorable lines. His most famous ones are better to reign in hell than in heaven serve. He's rejecting God's authority in this, the extraneous order of the physical world around him. And by this I mean that there are constraints on the self, imposed by the material world, and more significantly by objective morality. All of these things are things that are formed in the ideas of Satan, in the minds of Satan himself. Satan's the first person to express the modern Gnostic idea, the idea of self-creation. And self-creation is an idea that's at odds with the notion of a cosmic order. His visceral kick against a hierarchy of the creator projects the notion that morality comes from the self. As the story unfolds, we actually find that he lives out a notion, not just that morality, but also reality itself is created first in the mind and then it's projected out onto the outside world. That is something that originates from within the self. And he goes on this sort of circular way of thinking, that morality is created from the mind, morality creates its own reality, and then that reality then again creates morality. There's no end to where the circular logic starts or ends. And I think that's one of the intentions of the whole thing. That's one of the intentions of the idea, like, what is a woman? That's the question that tries to sort of get at the very inception of that, at the point where it all starts, and the point where it starts deviating from any notion of truth, that truth is self-evident or that truth is objective. There are many names for this, which come up in the writings of modern and ancient theorists. It might be called the will, or the spirit, or the consciousness. These are all intangible things that exist in this non-material plane. They're real, but the Gnostics actually think that they're more real than reality itself. That you can actually create reality from the mind first and project it onto the world. And this is why we hear in terms of linguists and such, that language and grammar creates reality. The Gnostic belief is that these intangible attributes are really independent entities of the corporeal body, that are trapped in the flesh, which is doomed to entropy, or the decay of the universe, and that the enlightened progression of all history is to liberate this spirit, an immortal thing, from its fallen vessel of the flesh. The Gnostics of the early Christian period literally said that there was a fallen God, a God of the flesh in the Old Testament, who was sort of a facsimile of a pure God of the spirit. So there's a dichotomy between the two things, and they separate these two things out. I'm not sure what this fallen God is supposed to have in common with Satan, whose name literally means the adversary, or the scatterer. So the Satan in this world is a little bit like your left hand and your right hand. Very, very similar to what you see in reality. But it's a sort of dysfunctional reality. And you actually see this sometimes on the biomolecular substructure, that the left-handed thing of the molecule makes the thing vibrate or function in a very dysfunctional manner. And I think this is one of the things that points to the sort of modern interpretive world, is that although it sort of reaches for some of the foundations of things that make sense, in the end it's dysfunctional because inherently it embraces the lie. Anyway, the Gnostic notion led to a lot of bloodshed and nihilistic contempt for the physical form of humanity. Milton's Satan makes an eloquent argument that reality comes from the self and is projected out into the world of matter and extraneously onto morality itself. He expresses the concept that morality is generated and does not reference any objective truth. Milton's Satan reflects the harsher implications of Descartes' famous axial revolt of cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum has a somewhat benign intellectual appearance of valorizing thought. And I think this is why it was always so popular. Though I think that is a somewhat naive summation of the implications of this idea when brought to its fullest extent. Satan verbalizes the principle. He doesn't hide his intent. And one of his most defiant lines reads, "The mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven out of hell and a hell of heaven make." Satan here rebukes any notion that there is an objective truth. And makes the argument that reality is as he defines it. There's more to this than a sort of a stoical acceptance of a bad circumstance. He's saying that reality will be formed first in the mind and then projected out onto the world. And this is an idea that I think in the 16th century was recognized as something that filtered out throughout philosophy throughout the ages. And we're seeing it again quite differently now, in which some people are arguing that the reality of biology is really something that just exists in a person's mind. And to change the mind is to change biology itself. The Orwellian question is, are we living in hell or heaven? Or how can you tell the difference? And what is hell and what is heaven? And what is reality and what is truth? All these questions spring from the deconstruction of objective reality. To quote Matt Walsh, what is a woman? For nothing can be questioned or counterclaimed. Milton's Satan is very progressive, you might have noted. Though he is one of the most powerful beings in the cosmological firmament, he protests that he is a victim. He, or possibly she or they, is the first champion of victim culture. But his intent is not hard to discern, for Satan, the prince of lies, or the confuser, or the scatterer, believes that in destroying the established order, he'll create the new power structures in this post-structural world. Prequel to this, Satan argues and acts out the case that there's no legitimate authority, and that the will to power is the only thing that actually counts. His rejection of the authority comes right down to the rejection of the limitations of the body, because the physical world of matter, defined by limits and scarcity, imposes the constraints of limits on the will. This opens up an interesting philosophical question that has had disastrous manifestations in the past and is opening up again before us through technology. In book 6 of Paradise Lost, Satan makes an interesting discovery. He discovers that his being is not tied to its physical form. And this echoes the modern technological philosophy of transhumanism. Satan, in the battle between the host of hell and the host of heaven, is indomitable and trusts in his physical strength and prowess. However, seeing Michael sweep great swathes in the rebel ranks, he crosses the field of battle to face his nemesis. Michael strikes Satan, and he cleaves him in two, and the fallen Satan is taken from the field of battle. However, though Satan feels pain, he heals, for he's immortal. And he realizes that his being is in his spirit and not in his body. He rejects the notion that he is both of the body and the spirit, and that these two things are entangled together, such as we have in the notion of Christ. And that his being is equally of matter and of spirit. It means that he needn't respect his own body. He needn't be limited by his body. His body is a vessel. Now he is only essentially a spirit. He's the sum of his thoughts and his will, like Descartes. Christ in the gospel is both spirit and flesh. His nemesis is a creature of pure spirit housed in a vessel of flesh, but not essentially a duality of the spirit and the flesh. This is the aftermath of Satan's encounter with Michael, where Michael cuts him in two from neck to hip. So reading directly from book 6 of Paradise Lost, line 344. Yet soon he healed, for spirits that live throughout, vital in every part, not as frail man, in entrails, heart or head, liver or reins, cannot but by annihilation die, nor in their liquid texture mortal will receive, no more than can fluid air. All heart they live, all head, all eyes, all ear, all intellect, all sense, and as they please, they limb themselves. And colour, shape, or size assume, as like them best, condensed or rare. Note, there's another interesting Hegelian concept here that has worked its way into the globalist culture. Satan is a shapeshifter, meaning form is inconsequential. He's not rooted to a spot or a physical point in space. And if we take this away from the individual and zoom it out to the concept of nations and the macro, we can think about it in terms of borders, not just in the body, but borders of nations. His form has no border, no boundaries. He is fluid. He does not depend on subsidiarity or localism for his identity. He is anywhere and he is anything. In the last two lines of the excerpt I just read, he states that a spirit can form a physical body around it. In line 348 through 49, he says that his body is merely matter and a spiritual essence inhabits, and that he can transcend this limit to the power of a spirit, or just his will. He doesn't depend on his limbs or organs to exist. If you want to recall the line, nor in their liquid texture mortal wound receive, no more than can the fluid air. So when his body is cut in two, it's compared to the cleaving of air. It will reform according to the will of his spirit, and he's completely independent of his body. This would be the sort of liberating principle of transhumanism. I'll look at that a little bit later. This is not the first time that Satan makes the claim that he is essentially of the intellect and not the body. If you remember another one of his lines, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven out of hell. He earlier claimed, echoing the words of Descartes. Here he takes that a step further and says that the spirit can be held in any body. He disentangles the dual nature of being, a state of being which requires being, to be present, to be physical. Something that is both physical and spiritual. The metaphysical debate around the physical and spiritual duality of humanity is nothing new. In the 3rd century, the ideas of Arius caused a schism within the Western theological thinking. His thinking on the nature of Christ promoted the idea that there was a fallacy in the belief of the divine being incarnate in God the Son, because the flesh is a sort of tainted thing, and the divine cannot be housed in it. There was a notion that a spark of the divine descended and was trapped in the evil world of the flesh. And if you think about it, the consequences of liberating the spark of the divine from the flesh, what do you do? The followers of this theological questioning arrived at a fundamental refutation of the physical part of humanity. In essence, they believed that God begotten could not be eternal, and from this came a belief that the body was evil, and that its soul was a captured spark of divine, fallen, and trapped within the body. The living physical world was a contaminated vessel, which had trapped the divine. The extrapolation from this was that if the physical world is evil, would it not be a good thing to liberate the soul from this depraved world and the vessel that had trapped it? It's not a huge logical leap. This sounds a little bit strange, counterintuitive, and hard to grasp on a fundamental level. It's a complex belief. But it could be simplified for a modern audience with the analogue of the nihilistic rejection of the corporeal element of life, the consuming, the disease, the dirt, the physical limitations, and its counterpoint, an embrace of the purely sentient, or the consciousness. Consciousness is a purified essence, it's the spirit. And in this comparison, the body is the degraded evil of humanity. If we could disentangle the human consciousness from the physical limitations of the flesh, we could achieve the Gnostic objective on earth. A sort of luxury technological Gnosticism. In the modern era, there's optimism that the technology can allow this, and that there is a techno-Gnostic movement seeking to explore this to its fullest. It differs a little from the early Gnostics, who view the dilemma as a conflicted entanglement between the supernatural and the spiritual. The modern Gnostics are atheists, but have a faith that technology can transcend the limits of humanity. It's hard not to see a glimmering hunger for eternal life in this enthusiasm, with which they speak of a technological singularity, a technological enabled moment which would allow humanity to break free of the constraints of the body and just become pure data, code, somewhere maybe uploaded into the clouds. Though this is an atheistic movement, it's hard not to see it as a desire to defeat death and become immortal. The fear of the void is an impulse that can afflict even the utterly godless, perhaps they're more so. There are many more religious analogues in this theory. In the techno-philosophical era, transhumanism is an attempt at detachment of the intellect from the limitations of the body. Technology, like the neurons in the brain, transfer data at the speed of light, but our sensing organs limit our ability to exchange ideas and data because they transfer data at a much slower rate. The senses and the body are the present impasse on this singularity, by which we will evolve out of our physical state. The darling philosopher of Silicon Valley, Yuval Noah Harari, offers a modern Gnostic vision enabled by technology. He's a historian and he's an author of Sapiens, in which he seeks to set human metaphysics in an evolutionary explanatory framework. He says that ideas are an accident of evolution. And this accident has led to the success of the human species. This idea is, well, it's sort of ground-shiftingly radical, because it takes a supernaturally stated Gnostic idea, where they said that the divine was trapped in the physical world of the flesh, and gives it a sort of a scientific, evolutionary explanation. In Harari's theory, the human is an evolving consciousness, not a physical being, but an evolving consciousness, trapped within the confining entropy limitations of the body. The body decays, it wastes away. But if we could just take that consciousness, we could make it eternal. Limited by entropy and the physical limits of the senses to interact with the world, human consciousness is limited only by the vessel in which it resides. He states that human consciousness will evolve beyond the human body. He believes that this will happen once humanity meets this singularity, this technological moment that will enable consciousness to exist somewhere else, not trapped within your mind or, let's say, your brain. And just making the distinguishment between the brain being a sort of a framework in which the mind exists. The first step in this is the replacement of the interface bottleneck between the processing power of the brain and the physical world. I say brain here and not mind because the brain can be viewed mainly as a technological mainframe in which the consciousness resides. The consciousness is the mind, the software, and the brain is just the best mainframe that we have at the moment for its storage and for its operation. The brain is basically a machine or a sort of a processor, and we could be swapped out for another processor, possibly a better processor. For instance, our eyes can only read so fast and we can only talk so fast. But what if information could be loaded up and down to our brains at the speed of electronic data signals? Elon Musk's Neuralink company is experimenting on this at the moment. It has its uses for helping neurologically damaged patients, which looks like a positive thing, but it also has the potential to create an augmented human. And the ethical questions with that are even more challenging than the technological challenges. The software-hardware metaphor is an old idea that keeps returning. And we might think of it as a luxury Gnosticism, a term coined by the writer Mary Harrington. The disentangling of the consciousness from the body is an ongoing project of transhumanism. It's a project to unlock the potential of consciousness, which relies on the senses, to process the world. Transhumanism is a step in cracking the greatest challenge of artificial intelligence, namely, how is intelligence possible without a sensing body to make value judgments? The dilemma for the AI people is that being is essentially about values, not about processing information. Values, as we know them, are primarily embodied. They're concepts, but they are judged and fine-tuned by how they affect physical and living things. Descartes never had to contemplate how he would think if he was not. Or say, to think if he was not, how would he do his thinking? His conceit was that he took the I am as this ipso facto fundamental, and he didn't require any further breakdown. He was not a fully signed up nihilist by the looks of things. The problem with our modern Gnosticism, which is the second stage of Descartes' questioning, is that it separates the I from the am. And this is the fallacy of Descartes, which if you pursue his thinking all the way, you can no longer say, I am. Remember when Satan says, all heart they live, all head, all eyes, all ear. Satan lists the organs of the senses as aids to the intellect and makes a distinction that they are separate from the essence of his being. He says that he can reform them at will. The spirit, as Satan describes it, bears similarity to what modern philosophers call consciousness, a thing that might be simulated or just captured in code. So can consciousness just be inserted into this alternative reality, in the digital world? That's the big question. That's a question that the AI coders are all spinning around trying to answer. It seemed like a good business model that someone might take up. In our present age, is the virtual world replacing the physical world? Is the metaverse a step in that? So as always, you have these sort of little intermediate steps where people are trying out the idea. The notion that you can get lost in a virtual world, even just from the virtual world of screening through a Twitter feed where you're sort of locked into the space of a screen, to the virtual world where you now have goggles which replace your senses of sight and the orientation of space and stuff. Are these all steps, or are they just fads? Here's a frightening thought. Would it be possible to upload a consciousness to a storage device, or even to the digital cloud, and then download it to another body, just like Satan proposes in Book 6, where he talks about reforming the body around his consciousness? Like Satan healing after his mortal wound and liberated from his body, does Bill Gates want to download his consciousness into another body? I'd hazard a guess that it probably wouldn't look much like the present vessel that houses the consciousness of Bill Gates. On a macabre note, I did notice a glint of panic in his eyes when he talked about the terror of dying from COVID. What if this pesky little bug were to cut short his life before we reach this singularity that they all so desperately talk about, which the programmers seem to think is just around the corner? Bill benefited handsomely from COVID, but there was something in his demeanour that led me to believe that he had a mortality complex also, and that the COVID scared Bill. He would, after all, be well aware that he would be in the demographic category that might just get topped off by COVID. When Bill warned about the danger of being the last person to die of COVID before the vaccines came out, he recalled the powerful mimetic image of Henry Gunter, the unfortunate American soldier who stuck his head above the trenches at, I think, about 10:59 on the 11th of, November 1918, and was shot just 1 minute before, probably less than a minute, before the ceasefire officially started. I did find it quite strange that when Bill talked about, you could be the last person to die, that he was recalling that thing. And he made the mimetic inference quite strongly, and was obviously a sort of an emotional shakedown in the population that he wanted to stick with the program. In older technological attempts to defeat death, such as cryogenic freezing, you at least had the physical matter in which the conscious lived to house the consciousness, even if it was transplanted into another body at some later date. This brings all type of clumsy sci-fi to mind, such as the character Krang in the Turtles, this brain that they sort of stick into the middle of a body. The transhumanist aim is a little more imaginative, to transfer the consciousness into a code and store it in the clouds, perhaps. The Holy Ghost, so to speak, which overarches the physical world of the Father and the Son. The Father, the Son being the old body and possibly the new body, and the consciousness is downloaded into. Where this new body might come from doesn't require much imagining. A modern, grotesque sci-fi analogue of the Snow Queen, staying forever young by draining the blood from young virgins. I know they claim to be atheists, but in the end it all sounds sort of religious to me. The transhumanist atheists are seeking eternal life. So here's another question. If you can upload your consciousness to the cloud and is separate from the entity of the body, can we not join these consciousnesses together to create a combined conscience of man? To transcend the limits of humanity, as they all talk about. This is as close as we can get to the making of a God man, and it will be a God of the intellect, not of the flesh. In short, it is of the spirit. The cloud is the Holy Ghost that overacts and connects all. Through the singularity, consciousness becomes purely technological and not bound by the biological. AI becomes a spirit of consciousness, the divine spark, which could combine to be the divine God. And this is the point of the singularity, where human intelligence becomes so intelligent that this technological ascension, that we won't even be able to comprehend it. But we will become one with the AI, a spirit of pure data, the computer God. The anticipation of this is messianical. And there's a sense of the end of times about it in the tone of Gates and all these other guys that are just reaching for this thing that they can become Nero-like in their ascension to godhood, before this old corpse decays before them. It must be done within the lifetime of his adherents. There is a sense in the talk of the prophets of techno-Gnosticism that this singularity must happen now. Otherwise, they fade into the nothingness of the Gnostic death of the body. Like the prehistoric Greeks really fading into the world of Hades. If life has an inherent flaw, it is death. To conquer death is to perfect flawed nature. Gnosticism believes that the natural world is evil and that we will receive unification with the perfect God in the next world. The transhumanists who don't believe in God, they say, shall find this in the eternal world of pure data. In Sapienship, Harari's philanthropical organization, he lists amongst his goals the need to raise awareness of the need to manage, regulate, and control our data in a way that serves the greater good. Here's my problem. While this might appear to be a syntactically coherent sentiment, it's entirely unmoored because the word good, without innate assumptions about its meaning, means nothing. The difficulty that a rationalist might have with this is that the meaning of the word good is unknowable without some a priori assumptions based on experience. It's a circular logic, but that's the point, because it points to the underlying rationalist fallacy, that values cannot be determined from a purely logical process without first referencing to fundamental values. You can't create values out of nothing. To make Harari's statement, we have to assume that good is an objective fundamental. It feels like he's pulling an illusionist trick by asking us to accept an implicit understanding of the adjective, which is defined in the domain of the physical, and apply that to a domain of the spiritual that disregards and rejects the prima facie assumptions of the physical. Can good be coded? Or like Satan's hell, is paradise in Paradise Lost, is it entirely a construct of the mind? What Harari discusses is what some saner minds call luxury Gnosticism. And this is the problem with it. At the end of the day, when Harari and Bill Gates are floating around in a cloud of pure data and making connections with a united consciousness at the speed of light, who will make sure that the electricity is still running? All of these esoteric theorists require that someone is around to make sure that the problem of entropy doesn't make the world come collapsing in on its flawed view of thermodynamics and physical reality. Hardware still wears out, whether it's in a human body or an AI framework, located somewhere in the cloud, which would probably actually be a huge digital warehouse not alone owned by Amazon. No matter how technologically superior the world is, there's always a necessity for hewers and drawers and someone to wash up. Even if that just means loading the dishwasher and pressing the button, it really requires a body at the end of the day. And it requires, you might say, a hierarchy between the Gnostic utopians and the serfs who will make sure that things keep running. While the philosopher king feasts, who does the wash up? Someone's got to do this dirty work with the utopia of Hegelian thinkers. Getting the dirty work done is a reality that can't be made real by pure thought. And this is where the Gnostics always disintegrate. This is the end of my talk on Gnostics and Paradise Lost. I hope it wasn't too confusing.